The most dangerous battle you will face in your life doesn't happen outside. It happens inside your head. It's not fought with visible weapons. It doesn't make a sound. It doesn't leave blood on the ground. But it can pulverize your purpose, your faith, and your identity without anyone noticing. While you smile in front of everyone, your mind may be silently whispering phrases that keep you bound. I'm not enough. I'll never change. God is tired of me. And the most unsettling thing is this. Many of those thoughts didn't start with you. They were implanted. They entered through wounds, failures, hurtful words, betrayals, past mistakes, and now they operate as if they were your own voice, when in reality they are invisible fortresses erected directly against your soul. Scripture is clear. You must renew your mind, because the mind is the battlefield where it is decided whether you will live in freedom or in bondage. It's not just a pretty phrase, it's a spiritual truth. What you think shapes what you feel directs what you decide, and your decisions shape the destiny you will inhabit. If your mind is programmed by fear, you will react from a place of fear. If it's programmed by guilt, you will walk hunched over even after God has forgiven you. Stay until the end, because I'm going to show you a spiritual and practical process that not only transforms thoughts, but also dismantles mental strongholds that have controlled you for years. It's not empty motivation. It's not superficial psychology. It's a profound principle that, if you apply it with discipline, can give you back control of your inner world and open a dimension of peace you may never have felt. But before we talk about freedom, you need to face something uncomfortable. Not everything you think is true, and not everything you think comes from within you, and that truth, though it may be challenging, can be the true beginning of your awakening. There are thoughts that present themselves as pure logic, but at their core, they carry poison. They don't raise their voices, they whisper. They don't attack suddenly, they infiltrate slowly. They begin as a small doubt after a mistake, as a faint voice after a rejection, as a shadow that appears after a loss. And if you don't confront them, they begin to build internal structures brick by brick until they transform into mental fortresses. A fortress isn't built in a day. It's formed through repetition. Repetition of painful memories, repetition of words that scarred you, repetition of failures you never truly processed. And when you realize it, you no longer react to what's really happening. You react to the distorted version that this fortress forces you to accept. The human mind is designed to create strong neural connections through repetition. What runs through your mind most often becomes what you believe most. And what you believe most ultimately defines who you think you are. That's why someone who failed once starts saying, "I'm a failure," and someone who was rejected begins to convince themselves that nobody loves me. The event was momentary, but the interpretation became permanent. This is how invisible chains are formed. You don't see them, but they weigh you down. They don't leave blood, but they tighten. On a spiritual level, these strongholds operate like dark filters. The truth tries to enter, but it bounces back. God says, "You are loved," but the stronghold responds, "I don't deserve it." God says there is hope, but the stronghold whispers, "You already tried, and it didn't work." And without realizing it, you end up believing the voice of the wound more than the voice of the Creator. That is the silent tragedy, a mind that repeats lies so many times that it begins to call them reality. And as long as that structure is not confronted, it will continue to direct your emotions like an invisible king sitting on the throne of your thoughts. There are 5 mental strongholds that silently control most people, and one may already be operating within you. The first is the thought of inadequacy. It's that persistent feeling of not being good enough, spiritual enough, intelligent enough, or capable enough. No matter how far you go, it always seems like it's not enough. It's a voice that diminishes your accomplishments and exaggerates your mistakes, pushing you to live in a constant competition for validation. This stronghold makes you believe that God demands absolute perfection to love you, when in reality, His grace was created precisely for your weakness. The second is the thought of condemnation. Here, the past becomes a prison cell. Old mistakes replay in your mind as if they were final judgments. Even if you've asked for forgiveness, even if you've changed, your mind insists on reminding you of who you were instead of who you are called to be. It's a continuous accusation that whispers you don't deserve another chance. And so, many serve God outwardly, while inwardly they remain bound by a guilt that was already nailed to the cross. The third strength is catastrophic thinking. It's always assuming the worst possible outcome. A small problem becomes an imminent disaster. A pending conversation feels like guaranteed rejection. A mild symptom becomes a serious illness in your imagination. This mindset drains the soul because it forces your heart to suffer again and again over scenarios that haven't even happened. There's also anticipatory rejection. Before you even try, you already see yourself being rejected. Before you speak, you're already convinced you won't be heard. Before you even put yourself forward, you've already accepted the no. And alongside this operates learned helplessness, that paralyzing belief that nothing will change because it didn't work before, as if the past has the final say on your future. 5 strengths, 5 invisible currents that shape your decisions, your emotions, and your relationships. And you may be starting to identify which one has been silently narrating your story right now. The problem isn't just that these strengths exist. The real problem is that they operate automatically. They don't ask permission, they don't announce their arrival, they simply trigger a thought, and you accept it as absolute truth. Something happens, and in seconds, your mind has already interpreted the situation according to the same old pattern. You fail at something small, and inadequacy whispers, "See, you never change." You remember your past, and the inner condemnation declares, "God tolerates you, but He's not proud of you." A new challenge arises, and learned helplessness dictates, "Why try again?" And so, thought after thought, emotion after emotion, reaction after reaction, your life begins to move according to an invisible program. The most delicate thing is that these ideas feel like your own. They sound like your own voice. They use your memories. They rely on real experiences. That's why they're so hard to identify. They don't arrive with a sign of lies. They arrive disguised as logic, prudence, supposed realism. But there's a clear difference between prudence and mental enslavement. Prudence protects you. Slavery holds you back. Prudence invites you to reflect. Strength forces you to retreat. And when you can't distinguish one from the other, you end up defending your chains as if they were wisdom. The mind wasn't created to be out of control. It was created to be guided. If you don't take authority over your thoughts will take authority over you. And when that happens, your life becomes a constant reaction to internal fears that no one else can see. That's where many pray for external change, without understanding that the root lies in their internal belief system. Because until you dismantle what governs you from within, you'll keep repeating the same cycles on the outside, even if the circumstances change. Mental liberation doesn't begin when you feel strong. It begins when you become conscious. As long as a thought operates in the shadows, it will have control over you. But the moment you expose it to the light, it begins to lose power. The first step to renewing your mind isn't praying louder or for longer, it's observing. Observing what you tell yourself right after you fail. Observing what scenario you imagine when something doesn't go as planned. Observing the automatic phrase that pops up every time you face a challenge. Because there, in that internal dialogue you repeat on autopilot, lies the root of strength. You have to learn to stop the thought mid-flow and question it. Is this a fact, or is it an interpretation marked by a wound? Does this strengthen my faith or sabotage it? Does this reflect the voice of God or the voice of my fear? Most people have never challenged their thoughts. They've simply accepted them as true. But a repeated thought doesn't become true by being repeated. It becomes a habit. And mental habits can be dismantled when they are exposed. Writing them down is a direct act of confrontation. When you put that phrase that lives in your mind, "I'm not enough, I always mess things up, no one chooses me," on paper, it stops being a vague feeling and becomes a concrete statement that you can challenge. That's where the break begins, because you can't tear down what you don't identify. You can't replace what you don't recognize. And as long as you keep calling what is actually harmful programming personality, you will continue protecting the same prison that is consuming you from within. Once you identify the thought, the second phase begins, replacing it. It's not enough to say, "I don't want to think like that." The mind doesn't operate in a vacuum, it operates by substitution. If you remove an idea but don't replace it with another, the old one returns with even greater force. That's why renewal isn't just about expelling, it's about implanting. Every destructive thought must be confronted with a higher truth. If the mind throws out, "I'm not enough," the truth affirms, "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." If condemnation insists, "Your past defines you," the truth responds, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come." It's not about repeating phrases out of habit. It's about retraining your internal belief system until the truth outweighs the hurt. Here's a key principle. Repetition builds pathways. Every time you repeat a lie, you reinforce the network that sustains it. Every time you repeat a truth, you begin to weaken the old structure. At first, it may feel uncomfortable, even unnatural, because your brain is already accustomed to the old programming. But just as a fortress was built through years of negative repetition, it can also fall through conscious repetition of truth. Renewing the mind is a daily practice. It's not an isolated emotional moment. It's constant discipline. It's waking up each day and deciding which voice will guide your inner self. It's filling yourself with words that strengthen your faith instead of feeding your fear. And in that process, something begins to transform in silence. Your reactions begin to change. Your emotions lose their negative charge. What once paralyzed you begins to lose its hold. Because when truth is consistently established, lies lose their foundation, and the structure that seemed indestructible begins to crack from within. But there's a deeper level than simply replacing thoughts. You need to strip away. Stripping away isn't ignoring, it's consciously relinquishing an identity you've been using for years. Maybe you dressed up as the one who always fails, the one who's never chosen, the one who can't change. Because familiar isn't always healthy. Many people cling to their pain because it's what they know. They've lived so long in that version of themselves that change feels strange, but you can't embrace your new identity if you're still holding on to the old one. After stripping away comes constant renewal, and then something even more challenging: dressing up. Dressing yourself in a new identity before you fully feel it. Acting like someone free while you're still in the process. Speaking like someone forgiven, even though your mind still remembers the past. Walking with confidence when the old voice tries to whisper insecurity. It's not hypocrisy, it's faith in action. It's deciding to align yourself with what God says you are, even when your emotions are still learning to catch up. And here's what happens. When you start behaving from your new identity, your mind begins to adjust to that reality. What at first seemed forced becomes real transformation, because identity isn't just believed, it's practiced, and every step you take as a renewed person weakens the authority of the old version that tried to continue silently ruling you. Now you understand why simply stopping negative thinking isn't enough. You need to cleanse the environment that's feeding those thoughts. The mind is fertile ground. Everything you consume becomes a seed. Conversations filled with criticism, content saturated with violence, news designed to trigger fear, social media that encourages constant comparison. All of that enters unannounced and begins to shape your perception of reality. Then you wonder why you feel anxious, insecure, or irritable without noticing that you've been watering the very roots you claim to want to uproot every single day. That's why mental fasting is such a powerful tool. Just as the body needs to detoxify from what harms it, your mind needs a period where you eliminate toxic stimuli. It's not about isolating yourself from the world. It's about taking conscious control of what you allow into your being. If you've been feeding fear for weeks, start feeding faith. If you've been consuming comparison, start consuming truth. If you've been listening to voices that weaken your identity, replace them with words that strengthen it. This fast not only cleanses, it also exposes. When you lower the volume of external noise, you begin to hear clearly what's really going on inside. And that's when you discover how many thoughts were triggered by constant stimuli. Comparison ignites when you scroll uncontrollably through social media. Anxiety skyrockets when you're repeatedly exposed to alarmist information. Insecurity grows when you measure yourself against unrealistic standards. By cutting off those sources, something begins to stabilize, not because the problems disappear, but because your mind stops being in a state of overstimulation. And in that intentional silence, the voice of God begins to be heard more clearly, as if it had always been there, waiting for you to turn off the noise so it could remind you who you truly are. There are 5 mental viruses that, if left undetected, will continue to rebuild the very strengths you try to dismantle. The first is constant comparison. Comparing yourself to others is a silent declaration that what God has given you isn't enough. Every time you measure your progress against someone else's outcome, you lose focus, gratitude, and peace. Comparison distorts your identity because it forces you to compete in races that weren't assigned to you. The second virus is destructive self-talk. That private conversation no one hears, but which defines how you see yourself. You don't need someone to criticize you if you're already doing it to yourself all the time. Every word you say to yourself creates an internal atmosphere. If you speak to yourself with contempt, your soul will live in a hostile environment. If you speak to yourself with truth and grace, your inner self will begin to heal. The third virus is repetitive obsession with problems. Thinking is not the same as ruminating. Thinking seeks solutions. Ruminating relives the pain. When you replay a negative situation without moving toward a solution, you are reinforcing the emotion associated with it. The mind begins to amplify the problem until it seems bigger than your faith. The fourth virus is anticipating negative futures. Living in "what if everything goes wrong" wears down the present. And the fifth is ruminating on the past, returning again and again to what you can no longer change. These viruses work together, forming invisible cycles that keep a person in constant anxiety. If you don't identify them, they will continue to sabotage any progress you try to make. But when you see them clearly, they cease to be invincible giants and begin to look like what they truly are: patterns that can be broken. Real transformation happens when you understand that repetition not only reinforces lies, it also establishes truths. Your brain is molded by what you consistently practice. If you practice fear, it becomes automatic. If you practice faith, it also becomes automatic. The mind doesn't initially evaluate whether something is constructive or destructive. It simply strengthens what you repeat most often. That's why daily discipline surpasses any fleeting emotion. You don't need to feel something extraordinary every day. You need to practice what is right every day. When you consistently declare a biblical truth, When you meditate on it and visualize it applied to your reality, you are forming new internal connections. At first, the old programming will resist. You will hear that old voice trying to regain ground. But each time you consciously choose to replace it, you reduce its power. It's like redirecting the course of a river. It doesn't change with a single attempt. It changes with sustained persistence. This is where many give up. They expect immediate results. But strongholds built over years aren't dismantled in an instant. Consistency is needed. Patience is needed. Active faith is needed. Repeating the truth begins to reshape your emotions, and your emotions begin to align with your new thoughts. What once triggered anxiety now encounters an internal barrier. What once paralyzed you begins to lose its power. And a day comes when you react differently to a situation that would have previously overwhelmed you. Not because the problem is smaller, but because your mind no longer operates from the old framework. At that point, you understand that renewal wasn't just a concept, it was an internal reconstruction. And what is being silently rebuilt begins to be reflected in every visible area of your life. All of this leads you to an undeniable truth. Whoever masters their mind, masters their life. This isn't just an inspirational phrase, it's a spiritual principle. Your thoughts shape your emotions. Your emotions influence your decisions. Your decisions build your future. If your mind remains captive, your life will reflect that imprisonment. But if your mind is renewed, your reality will begin to align with that inner freedom. Every visible transformation always stems from an invisible revolution. Many expect God to change their circumstances first, when in reality, He wants to transform their way of thinking first. Because if the scenery changes, but the mind remains the same, you'll repeat the same cycles in a different environment. Mental renewal isn't an add-on to spiritual growth. It's the core. It's the point where faith ceases to be a concept and becomes a daily practice. It's where you stop reacting from a place of hurt and begin responding from your true self. There will be days when the old voice tries to return with intensity. There will be times when you feel stuck, but every time you consciously choose truth over falsehood, you strengthen a new inner structure. Don't underestimate the small, repeated acts of mental obedience. Don't underestimate the power of a statement made with conviction. Don't underestimate what happens when you decide to shut the door on a thought you would have previously let in. Freedom doesn't appear when all negative thoughts disappear. It appears when you learn to govern them. And when you discover that you can direct your mind instead of being swept away by it, something stirs within you, a spiritual authority that was always there, waiting for you to make the decision to wield it. Mental freedom is possible, but it doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't spring from a momentary inspiration or an emotional peak in prayer. It happens when you decide to take responsibility every day for what you allow to live in your mind. Every thought you accept is a seed. Every thought you reject is pruning. Every truth you repeat is a new foundation. And over time, almost without noticing, your inner landscape begins to change. Where there was once constant fear, peace begins to grow. Where repetitive guilt dominated, grace begins to take root. Where powerlessness reigned, a firm resolve emerges. It's not about denying reality or pretending that difficulties don't exist. It's about interpreting reality from a mind aligned with God's truth, not from the distortion of old wounds. A renewed mind isn't naive, it's resolute. It doesn't ignore problems, it faces them without letting them define who you are. When your inner self is transformed, so is your posture. You walk differently, you decide differently, you speak differently. You no longer react like someone trapped in automatic thoughts, but like someone aware of their spiritual authority. This process demands discipline, consistency, and courage. There will be resistance. There will be days when it seems easier to return to old patterns. But every time you choose to remain in the truth, you are strengthening a new inner structure that no memory of the past can tear down. And then you understand something powerful. The battle was always in the mind, but the key was also there. When you decide to renew your mind in Christ, you don't just transform thoughts, you transform your story. Because a changed mind produces a changed life, and in the silence of your inner being, where there was once chaos, a peace begins to take root that doesn't depend on circumstances, but on conviction. There you discover that true freedom wasn't escaping the world, but learning to govern your inner world.